Happy Thursday, Faith family. Since it's Thursday, you know that's time where we mention the exciting things coming up this Saturday at the 7th Collective starting at 11 a.m. We are doing our 7th for the 7th Collective core value, where we're going to be talking about what does it mean if these core values have to move from being just things we mentally agree with to things that we actually live. Whoa, what an idea! So you don't want to miss it. That's starting this Saturday at 11 at the 7th Collective. But you know what? Before we get to the 7th and last core value, we still, I believe, have some extra questions remaining from the 6th core value.
That is right. And we shall dub this Collective Thoughts Volume 2. And since it's Christmas season, let's get in the spirit.
That looks more like an alien spaceship is about to take us.
Well, we can party.
Oof.
Okay.
You're going to have to put a disclaimer for seizures on this video.
Yes, that's right. Here we go, Pastor Henry. 1, 2, 3 questions that were remaining from this past week, and let's get right into it.
Cool.
Here we go. Where is the line between gossip and gathering the, quote, 2 or 3 for the return visit, or outside of that, seeking counsel?
Ooh, okay. So where is the fine line, or I guess they didn't say fine, but the line between gathering 2 or 3 people to assist you and gossiping? Well, I think the line is, again, in the definition of gossip. I'm going to give that again. What is our working definition of gossip that we talked about last Saturday? And it's this: conversations about persons not present involving unconfirmed details with people unable or unwilling to directly do anything about the situation or the person being spoken of. Okay? That is our definition of gossip. You're talking with people that are unwilling or unable to do anything about the situation, about details you can't really confirm or deny or anything else, right? So the fine line between gossip and gathering the 2 or 3, I would say, let's just give some practical lines right here. If you wanting to seek counsel, and I put that in air quotes because you'll see in a minute what I'm saying here. If you wanting to seek counsel, go talk to somebody who may be your friend, maybe you think has some wisdom, but you know is not really going to assist you in this. You know what I'm talking about? In other words, they're not going to go talk to this person with you. They don't have a track record of going and helping people talk to people about stuff, but they are your listening ear for things. And while that sounds nice, that would meet the definition of gossip, right? What you're trying to go to here, remember we talked about this, you're not going to these people as a coping mechanism or as a quick dopamine hit, right? You're not going to somebody to get validated, to be the hero of the story. You want to go to someone who is spiritually mature, someone that you look to and you go, I think they have a track record, they have some maturity spiritually there, to seek counsel and to get assistance, right? You want someone that can call you on stuff if necessary. Not saying that you did anything wrong, but you want somebody who can have that outside perspective, but have some wisdom with it and isn't afraid to call you on it, not just pat you on the back and go, my, aren't you a super trooper? Right, that kind of thing. So that's really, again, in the nutshell, the definition of gossip tells us where the line is. Is the person I'm going to define, right, are they really going to be able to do something about this and counsel me, or are they not? Because we don't want to now couch gossip behind, well, you know that person's not really going to help, but you got to tell 8 people until you can find 2 of the 8 that would help you. Okay. Let's just not play semantics here, right? That's right. If you go into 8 to find your 2 and then go, it's not gossip, I was trying to find somebody. That's gossip, right? So just the person you're going to, are they really going to help? Are they really going to be able to do something about it or not? That's really just the line. Let's just not play games, folks. The church is better than that.
Absolutely. Never said that these steps would be easy. They would be different than what we typically do today, but very good insight. All right, question number 2, and apologize for our background noise here. The background noise, his name is Rocket, and he likes to be heard.
Yes,
all right. Question 2. Obviously, our approach for this past week's sermon was us doing confronting, if you will, or reaching out to someone if they've wronged us.
Right.
So let's take this question. I thought it was very appropriate. Is there any scripture that discusses the opposite side of this past weekend's message? Meaning, conflict resolution when we call out someone else's behavior is one side, but also us seeking resolution when we find a fault in ourselves and others' willingness to address and help us. What does that look like?
Okay, that's a very introspective question, and I appreciate that. That kind of goes along the line of what we were talking about, that one of the first steps in any conflict management is self-reflection. Pause and think, right? So that is a thinking question. I really like that one. So if I'm understanding this correctly, they're saying, okay, it's one thing to tell me how do I go confront somebody else, but how do I deal with my own holdup is what I kind of take out of that. In other words, how do I confront myself, right? And then beyond that, I'm glad that they picked up on that as a Christian. How do I maybe get help from someone else on my issue, right? It's kind of a reverse. I'm not seeking counsel from someone to go deal with someone else. I'm seeking help from someone to deal with me, right? That's a deep question. That takes a lot of spiritual humility and maturity to ask that. So just a couple of verses. Yes, there's obviously scripture dealing with this. Just a few that come to mind. Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4. I have that pulled up here on my phone if you're wondering what I'm looking at here, my Bible app here. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others, right? That may come out. In other words, well, what should I do with dealing with my own issues? Well, the first thing is to realize that you're not just looking out for your own issues for your sake. You're looking out for your own issues to help not be a violator of other people as well. Because here's the truth of humanity. Hurt people hurt people. If you don't deal with your hurt, you will end up hurting someone else. That is inevitable. We are not islands unto ourselves. You can't just be like, well, I'll just hold on to it and I'll deal with it in my own time. Yeah, you're going to deal with it or other people are going to deal with it, right? All together. So, the first thing is realizing you need to deal with your stuff. That is important. But another scripture would say you have to esteem, and we'll come back to this in another question, I believe. You have to esteem others better than yourself, right? And it's really just talking to, not that you're a doormat, right? But it's talking about humility, right? So dealing with your own problem takes humility. That would be a scripture that talks about that. Matthew 7, 1-5, this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, comes to mind where Jesus says, hey, in fact, I think, Michael, you were preaching on that passage.
Back in the day.
Back in the day in our Matthew series, so go check that out. It is online. But we were talking about, hey, don't look at the speck in your brother's eye before you deal with the beam that's in your own. Because if you deal with that, you get the beam out of the way, you'd be able to see the speck in your brother's eye and actually be able to assist them, right? It's kind of a fancy way of saying, how are you going to do surgery and get the speck out of someone's eye when you can't see around the log, right? It's not a competition of who's got the worst problem. It's just reality. Again, hurt people hurt people. If you're not dealing with your own holdups, you're not going to probably be very effective at dealing with somebody else's. In fact, usually what gets us in trouble is when you don't deal with yours and we use as a coping mechanism trying to heal somebody else, and then we just destroy both of us, all right, because we're not dealing with that holdup. So again, that would be another step of how do I resolve my own issue? Well, you need to be humble about it. You really need to address it, and you need to esteem others ahead of yourself. In other words, you need to view your own holdup. Don't put it out of whack, but your own holdup is a more important issue to deal with ahead of the other person's, right? Because you're not going to be able to truly help them if you're not even getting help, right? That kind of thing. And then a final verse that comes to mind because it deals with, they say, well, what about others in the church being willing to help us? Well, that's Galatians 6, 1-5, where Paul is talking about, hey, if someone is overtaken in a trespass, in a sin, then we should bear one another's burdens. It's a passage about that. Now, I'm not going to be exhaustive in that passage because we did preach a series on Galatians that you can find online or on our YouTube. So go to Galatians 6 if you'd like to get more details on that. But really, it is a call that as a covenant community, we talked about this last Sabbath, we're not supposed to be a cancel culture. We're not supposed to be kind of a judgment culture in the sense of I figure out what's wrong with you and then discard you. The church should be willing to help people that aren't habitually doing the same thing over and over again, right? Who are not continually engaging in the thing, but they're messing up in some way, or they recognize they're messing up in some way. We have a scriptural obligation to assist someone, right? So if you realize you're struggling with an issue and you need counseling, or you need mentoring, or you need to talk it through with someone and say, hey, can you help me figure out how I'm going to deal with this, on myself, which again, it's not gossip. If you're talking about you are the party, right? So that goes back to that earlier question, right? You can talk about you all day long, I guess, hopefully not in a conceited way, but right. And come to that. Well, the church does have an obligation to try and do something to assist you in getting healing, which can be uncomfortable for us, right? Because maybe we're like, oh, that's exhausting. I don't want to hear about their drama or their holdup. Well, yes, if that person is always doing that just because they want to be the center of attention, that's one thing. But again, Galatians 6 will differentiate that. Go look at that message. But those are some verses that come to mind on the flip side of that message.
Perfect. Here's what we'll do to make it simple to find those messages. Look in the comments, and we're going to link them.
Like show notes.
There we go. We'll link one from Matthew and link 7. The one from Galatians. And then check those out if you have some extra spare time on your hands.
Great idea.
All right. Question number 3. Here it goes. When we look at Matthew 18, and quote, if your brother sins against you, is the first question to ask before proceeding with the reconciliation described. Continues, while sin is a huge, complicated topic, are there some questions we can ask ourselves to decide if our brother has sinned against us or just hurt us?
Okay, this is very good. Now, to be fair, I'm going to be, disclaimer here. I am cheating a little bit on this question. Normally, when we get questions right after the message, right, I'm hearing them for the first time. I'm having to think right off the top of my head. So sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't always have everything, believe it or not, floating around in my head very organized. So we try and do the same thing with these questions. When they come in, I really only hear them either just before the taping of these, a few minutes, or then right during it. But this one, because I needed to be a little bit more organized with how I did this, I did get that about an hour before this, and I did take time right here on my phone to write out some questions because I just thought that would be more valuable. Let's just use the fact that I do have a little extra time. So I am cheating, but if you wonder what I'm looking at, I put some of these down on my phone. So are there some questions we can ask ourselves to determine if really someone has sinned against us or just hurt us, just inconvenienced us, or any number of variations on that? Excellent question. Here's a few questions I jotted down that I think would be helpful for us to ask. 1, and we talked about this some Sabbath, so this is a great place to start. Is there clear biblical language for this offense? Okay, so think about whatever happened to you or you believe happened to you, and is there a clear passage about that thing? Because the Bible doesn't go exhaustive on everything, but there are some, right? Like gossip, slander, theft. Like those are some pretty clear things, right? Murdering my animal. Okay, there's some clear principles in the Bible that would define, yeah, that's a sin. Okay, that wasn't just hurt, that was sin. So that would be step 1. Okay, step 2, ask yourself, was the person that sinned or hurt you, whatever it actually ends up being, was their intent to harm you, or was it an accident? Okay, so in other words, you got to try and discern if there's any data in the event that can tell you the person's motive. Did they act with malice? Was it the result of carelessness or ignorance or emotional distress, right? Again, we said hurt people. Sometimes when people, I realize I do this even in my own marriage, for example. Sometimes when you're flustered and someone else has hurt you, you accidentally lash out and hurt the other person, or you react in a way you normally wouldn't react. And that doesn't excuse the fact that you then hurt someone else. But I'm saying, right, sometimes getting into the mindset, trying to get into the mindset of someone and figure out why did they really do this, will help you know if it's a sin or hurt, right? It's something else if it was intentional. This person was like, no, they came into the room ready to just whack you, right? There's another thing if you kind of walked into the room when they just got whacked by somebody else and you were the first one they walked up on and they're kind of flailing. It's kind of the old adage, if someone's drowning, they accidentally try and often drown the person coming to save them. Right? Well, it's still bad, but motive is different than knowing they tried to drown me or that person was so busy trying to not drown, they accidentally drowned me, kind of thing. Motive is important. There is a Bible verse I would throw into that, and it's Romans 12:3, where we're told as Christians, and this is a hard principle, but the Bible, God loves us enough to give us hard principles. Independent of enough data points to prove motive, the Christian must always assume the best motive in somebody else. In other words, if there is not a clear thing you can point to figure out what their motive was, The default for a Christian is to assume they didn't do it with malice.
Woo!
Yeah, I know that's hard, right? Because when we're hurt, our default is, well, I'm just going to assume it was evil, right? We fill in stories in our head. They meant to, steal that from me. They meant to hurt me. They think about me all the time, and their only wish is to damage and destroy me, right? Okay, and yes, that's a very normal human sinful way of thinking. But as Christians, we are told to assume the best about people's motives because man looks at the outward appearance. This is Samuel. Remember, God told him this about making a king in Israel. But God looks at the heart. And since ultimately you and I are not God, we cannot look at the heart. We can only go off of if we see any clear data. But in the absence of data, or even with what data we think we know, even if you're like, look, there's 2 clear data points, and I think they're bad. Well, if those data points can at all be skewed positive, the Christian has to skew it positive till proven otherwise. So that's really hard, but that's the next question. Was there intent to harm or was it an accident? Third question really quick. Is my reaction to the sin or the hurt I think I've had, whatever it is my reaction out of proportion to the offense? Okay? So in other words, is your emotional response being amplified by your own holdup? Right? In other words, try and think, and again, maybe some counsel will help you, is the thing this person said or did to me, not justifying it, not saying it's right or wrong, but is the pain I'm feeling being amplified by something that would not normally cause this reaction? In other words, if someone comes into the room and goes, man, those are ugly shoes. How could someone be so dumb to buy those? Okay? Not saying that's a nice thing to say, but I'll just say, if somebody came in and told me that, naturally, I'd probably be annoyed. I'd say, well, that's a little rude, right? But that would be my reaction. But now here's the thing. If someone tells you to that and you have a personal wound that growing up, people always called you ugly or stupid or you have poor choices or whatever, so you are used to being the butt of people's insults,
Yep.
right? And you're used to people making value judgments about you as they say something like that. Well, then I can imagine when someone comes in the room and says that, not good, but statement, you could obviously interpret that even worse than I would, right? You go, really? You're insulting me like I'm a pile of garbage and I won't stand for, in other words, I get why someone would respond that way, but we need to ask ourselves, is my response out of proportion to what it really is? If I didn't have this history, would I be reacting this way? And it's okay to admit you have the history, but it's something important to help us filter how should I respond to this. Couple last ones. Actually, those are 3 good questions to ask. Here's 3 quick ones if you are still in conversation with this person, right? If you haven't had time to walk away from it, this might help you. Or I would say, going with Matthew 18, these might be 3 good questions that someone spiritually mature might ask you to ask the person when you try and go back and have another conversation about the hurt of the sin. And it's this. Ask the person, what do you think happened from your perspective? All right? It gives them a chance to explain their actions and maybe get their perspective before you immediately assume the negative motive. Or to admit they had a negative motive. What do you think happened? Well, I was mad at you for this, so I just wanted you to eat it. Okay, well, now you have some pretty clear motive, right? But they told you, okay? Or maybe they go, man, that person just said something nasty to me and you walked in the room and I was already short-tempered, or I worked a night shift and I was tired and you said that and I snapped. And, I shouldn't have said that. So in other words, this kind of goes to the second question. What were you thinking when you did that? That kind of sounds like the first one, but maybe that's the one that helps people really get through their own thoughts, right? And then finally, how do you feel about what happened? Because I can tell you this, I don't always do this. I'm not speaking as a hero expert that always does this. These are things that when I think about myself, what do I need to get better at? Sometimes when you ask that, this will be telling. If someone goes, man, like I just said, I was tired. I really shouldn't have done that. I wish I hadn't said that. Well, that's going to tell me a lot about intent. If they're like showing remorse in the way they talk about it, or they're like, man, I really didn't mean to hurt you, or I feel crummy about that, versus I said that, you really should get over how you feel about, okay, well, now they're defensive, or they don't think it's bad. That might influence how I respond, or other people respond to them if we have to keep escalating steps in Matthew 18, right? That's 6 questions, and I'm going to end, since this is our last question, with 3 final considerations on this. I'm trying to get very practical. That's why I wrote this down. First of all, another Bible verse, again, you can't know the person's heart for sure. I just want to re-stress this again. And the Christian should always assume good motive in the absence of clear data. Okay? Second of all, this goes with our second question. You need to prioritize humility. Before we confront somebody, we need to be honest about ourselves, right? We are not the heroes and we're not perfect either. Now, that's not an excuse to be a doormat and let people get away with evil and sin. But I'm just saying it's one thing to deal with it if you realize we're all equal at the foot of the cross. One of us is not worse than the other. Yes, they did a bad thing, but there is a difference between recognizing what the action somebody did is bad and thinking the person is bad. Right? These moral judgments. It gets us in trouble all the time. It is perfectly appropriate as a Christian to confront someone and say that action was bad. But it is very inappropriate for us to do like the world and go, therefore, because your action was bad, you are bad. Right? That kind of gets into cancel culture again. Right? Until we have data. Christians have to be better than that. Right? And then the final thing I would say on that is consider overlooking the offense. Okay, if it's not a sin and it's just hurtful, or even if it is a sin, now again, this takes maybe some wise counsel and some prayerful thought. I'm not saying this is just a catch-all for everything, but I would say Christians should also consider whether you can overlook the offense. And what I mean by that is this. If the sin, even if it is a sin, if it's not major, two caveats on this. If it's not a major one, I mean, all sin is bad, but I'm just saying there's a difference between they murdered somebody or ran over your dog or whatever versus they just said something nasty, okay? If it's not major, and second, if it's not ongoing, okay? It's one thing if it happens once, it's something, you're like, okay, I might overlook it, but when it keeps happening repeatedly, right? If it's not ongoing and it's not major, then the Bible does give us a verse, and I just throw this out for our consideration, 1 Peter 4:8, where it says, love covers a multitude of sin. Okay? It's a weird-sounding verse, but what it's saying is, just as God has extended us grace, part of healing can be extending grace to others, and grace is unmerited favor. Sure. Right? Yeah, you do have a right to go confront them on every single sin that they've done as a Christian. They signed up for that after all, okay? Yes, you have a right. But God had a right to wipe us out too, and he didn't, right? How many things does God overlook, right? He's not rejoicing in iniquity or unrighteousness, but how many times has God not thrown the book at us when we deserved it? I know sometimes God has to really stand up to us, and we've all been there where we've had to eat our consequences, but I'm just saying this is one thing to consider too. Even if you can find out it is a sin, it might be a good time to prayerfully ask, is this a sin that I can cover with love and just drop it? And avoid unnecessary conflict. Now, we don't want to be avoidance, right? That's not healthy either, but right, it's just something to consider. So I know that was a lot to dump on you, but I wanted to really kind of get into the nuance of that question.
Yeah, it's like that other thought in Galatians. Love is patient and kind, and sometimes patience and kindness may have to outweigh. I'm going to go confront my brother or sister.
Yeah, they deserve to know. Well, I mean, yes, and probably again if it's habitual and pretty major, but if it's only the first time they've done this to you and it's not, I mean, yeah, it's bad, but do you really have to go slug them on the first attempt? It's just something to consider.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, good questions this time around. And we've come to enjoy this time, whether it's during the service or after, like we've done here. So we hope you all find these valuable. Keep asking the questions at the end of the sermons because we're going to keep answering them. So other than that, have a great week. Hoping to see you Saturday, online or in person.
See you then.
Bye-bye.